From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Oh my gosh. Don't worry, we're giving him the full half hour. We're not kicking him out early, I promise, I promise. Thank you all for sticking around. You sure you're not here just to get out of the rain? You're actually here for George? Just checking. How many native Washingtonians do we have here? Oh, excellent. Well, as one myself, I used to have this pet peeve. Maybe you did too. The books that people used to like to call Washington novels. You can't hear? It's still out there, huh? I don't know what to tell you. Where, is it stop? Where does the sound stop? Hold on. Should we just keep going? Can you hear me now? Oh my gosh, George, right into it. Think rock star, man. Right into the microphone. Jeez. Washington novels. Remember what they used to be called? They used to be about rogue spies and terrorist conspiracies and who's got their finger on the red phone, who's boffing the senator, that kind of stuff. No relation to Washington, right? The neighborhoods where so many of us live and travel. Then along comes this guy named George Pelecanos, who actually cared about the stuff that happens outside the monumental corridor, east of the Anacostia, beyond camera range. Starting with a book called A Firing Offense, continuing through titles like The Sweet Forever, King Suckerman, Soul Circus, The Night Gardener, and most recently, The Way Home. George Pelecanos has shown us our mean streets and the people who struggle for a footing there. He's given us Washington, warts and all. And he's given us Baltimore, too, as a writer and producer for The Wire, one of the masterpieces of American television. Yeah. Embedded journalist, fierce social critic, an expert in the catalogs of Minor Threat and Rare Essence, and the kind of mensch you can call up out of the blue and say, George, how does this work? And he tells you. Please welcome a fine and deeply humane writer, and in the truest sense, a Washington writer, George Pelecanos.
Thank you. Thanks, Lou. It's what I like, a captive audience, you know? Just let it rain. You're going to hear a lot today about why reading books is good for you. But last week I read an editorial in the Washington Post that really stuck with me. It was by a guy named R. Dwayne Betts. And this young man grew up in Suitland. He got involved in some bad things. He did a carjacking many years ago. And it was in Virginia, so he was sent to Virginia. And actually, as a 16-year-old, he was sent as an adult. So he did 9 years in an adult prison in Virginia. The reason he wrote this editorial was because recently Virginia correctional officials blocked an organization called the Quest Institute, which is a nonprofit out of Charlottesville, from sending books to prisoners in that state under the Books Behind Bars program. And because they found some things in the books like CDs and paper clips. When Mr. Betts was in prison, he was in solitary, and the guys that were in solitary weren't allowed to have books, so naturally they devised a way to get books, and they made up this elaborate system of pulleys and weights and ropes and to get books to each other. And one day, a book found its way into his cell called The Black Poets. It was an anthology of poetry from people like Gwendolyn Brooks and Langston Hughes. And he read the contents over and over again, and he began to write. Just last week, his first book was published. It's called A Question of Freedom, a memoir of learning, survival, and coming of age in prison. And it's because that book got in there. I just want to read briefly from the last 2 paragraphs of his editorial. Now, 10 years later, every time I walk into a classroom to teach poetry, I remember how one book changed my life. I remember how, when I was more than wrong, there was someone who thought a book could lead to change and got that book into my hands, even if no one else thought I deserved it. One book slipped under my cell door by someone I didn't know. One book donated by an organization that believed that, no matter what, an education can save you. That's his story. One book changed this guy's life. For me, it was a teacher at the University of Maryland, Charles Misch. Any teachers in the room, thank you very much for what you do. Okay, this leads into a discussion of my latest book. It's called The Way Home. The idea of this book grew out of my work out at the Juvenile Correctional Facility for DC youth. It used to be called Oak Hill. It's now called New Beginnings. And I was out there one day, and I was in a kid's cell, and while he was in class, just all right. Okay, yeah, I hear you. I hear you. The schedule's getting backed up too, so I'm going to make this fast. But anyway, I was in this cell, and it's a 6x9 space. There's a cot. There's a commode sitting nakedly out there on the floor. There's a piece of plexiglass that you can't see through. And I thought, what's it like for a boy to be in prison? And what's it like for his parents? And the people who love him? And ultimately, how do they recover from this experience, and how do they get back together? How does this boy find the way home? So the book is about a guy who grew up actually in a nice house in Upper Northwest in Friendship Heights, but he keeps getting into trouble. And if it comes to that, there's only one place in D.C. where you go to juvenile jail. They don't have a separate one for the well-off white kids, okay? So he goes out to this place called Oak Hill. I call it Pine Ridge in the book. And the middle section of the book is him in prison and what happens to him there. And it's not what you think. It's not, oh my God, what happens to the white boy when he goes to this prison. It is more about what relationships he makes and how he emotionally comes through this experience. And the book goes 10 years forward, and you meet all these guys again that he knew in prison, and you find out what happened to them and how they still struggle with putting this behind them. Now, this is a crime novel. I don't want you all to think that I've gone soft or something like that. So, somebody makes a very poor decision in this book, and these guys come into town and some really awful things happen. It's almost like, if you can imagine a Western, because all my books are really Westerns. It's Jack Palance and L.Q. Jones ride into town, and mayhem ensues, But the book is really about this fathers and sons and how they find each other. Quickly, one thing that I did find when researching this book is that teenage boys are wired differently. There's actually a physiological reason for the things that they do. If you take one of those heat imaging pictures of a boy's brain when he's 16, the majority of it is given over to impulse and adrenaline. If you take a picture of that same brain when that boy's a 22-year-old man, the majority is given over to conscience and reasoning. So the next time you're tearing your hair out and wondering why your kid's acting the way he's acting, at least think about that. And this is one of those physician heal thyself things, because I'm an emotional Greek, and certainly I don't always follow that, that policy around my own house, but I am trying, you know what I mean? So anyway, that is The Way Home. The one last thing that I want to say is I want to mention another book that came out a couple weeks ago. I wrote the introduction to it. It is a republication of a book called Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter. And it was published in the mid-'60s. It also delves into these themes of juvenile delinquency, and it follows this guy through his life from the 1940s to the 1960s. I think it's an American classic. I don't get a piece of the action if you buy that book, but I highly recommend it. You want to read a great book, Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter. So thank you very much. I'm going to take questions. Yes, sir.
One thing I just wanted to ask you is, I noticed with your style of writing, your character, the richness of the way you write about DC and the sub-stories within the main story. Like, for example, you talk about racism within the DC schools and the suburban liberalism and how they don't exactly walk the walk in terms of the things they say.
Yes.
And some of the side characters. And I guess what my question is, I noticed with books like The Night Gardener and The Way Home, you have numerous themes like this in there. Do you start out thinking, oh, I want to write a thriller? Or is it basically start out like as a book like, oh, I just want to write about DC because I'm interested in these people?
Okay, I think, let me just boil down the question. It was, that's okay. You know, when I start to write a book, do I think, well, now I'm going to write a thriller and it's going to be plot-driven, or do I think about the themes that I want to get to, such as the gentleman mentioned, you know, racism in the public school systems and that sort of thing. I really have to get amped up to write a book. I have to be passionate about what I'm doing. So it very rarely is a plot-driven kind of thing with me. It almost always starts out with something that I read in the newspaper that makes me angry, or going to the prison, which makes me angry, or in the case of The Night Gardener, it was the forgotten lives of these 8 girls who were murdered back in the 70s, and on the other side of town, primarily in Southeast, and in the district's biggest serial murder case that went unsolved. Why aren't we talking about that? You know, at the anniversary of that killing recently, the Post ran 5 front-page serial articles on the Chandra Levy case, and not to disrespect her or her memory in any way, but you know, I've been saying for years that why are the violent deaths of Black Washingtonians buried inside Metro every day with you know, check your newspaper today, because there's one in there where somebody got 1 sentence. One was shot and one was critically injured in Southeast. And yet on the front page of the Post, you very often can read an article about what middle school girls are wearing to school this year. You know what I mean? And so those are the kind of things that get me stoked to write a book, basically. Yes? I'm good. Okay. Okay, well, let me rephrase that. The question was about the fate of Omar, because not everybody has seen the show. So I can tell you that we really deliberated over that for a long time. We didn't know what was going to happen to him, and also the way that we did it was discussed for days, because something strange that happened is that Omar became this folk hero on the show. And we liked the character a lot. We loved the actor, all that, and we saw that he was in a strange way. He was one of the most moral people on the show. He had a code, but we didn't want people to mythologize him in the sense that young people would look at him and say, "I want to be Omar," because that was really happening. You could feel it, and so his fate happens in a very unromantic way, and even when it hits the newspaper, they look at it and they throw it in a box, and it's like just another yo in Baltimore. You know, we're not even going to write about it. So that's how that happened. Okay?
Yes. Mr. Pelecanos, I'm a prosecutor, prosecutes violent crime in six districts.
Yes.
When I read Soul Circus, your book could be like fiction. It read like a documentary to me. And I'm thinking, like, when I read the book, I looked at your picture, and I said, I wonder what this guy looks like. Like, look at you, and he's not from 6 feet. So I'm figuring out how are you getting into the fringes, and not only are you getting into like how they do it, you're getting into like their thought process and their motives, and you're doing with such pinpoint accuracy. I'm just trying to figure out like where you getting it, because you're like.
Thank you. This is a prosecutor in the city, and I think I might have met you before. I've been up on your offices anyway. I definitely met you today. The question really boils down to, like, how do I get into everybody's head at different cultures than I am, economic backgrounds and so on. And you really have to, I set out, when I started writing these kinds of books, I kind of made a pledge to myself that I wasn't going to fake it, and that it would be a betrayal of not just of the readers, but the people that I'm writing about, if I don't at least try to get it right. and go out and get engaged in the world. So that's what I do. I'm often in neighborhoods where I don't, I don't live there, I don't belong there probably, and I'm just talking to people. And this is a lifelong thing. It helps that I've lived here my whole life. It helps that my dad had a diner downtown and that I was always immersed in this sort of blue-collar Washington world from the time I was 11 years old. And I've been listening my whole life, if if you guys are trying to write a book or you're thinking about it, just remember that everybody has a distinct voice. Don't start from the place of what color that person is or how much money they have or whatever. To create them to talk in a certain way, you have to listen to people because the voices are rich and varied. Thank you. Thanks. Am I done? Anybody else? Okay. Can you use the mic? I can't. It's dead? Yeah, come closer. Yes. Okay, the two questions, was I influenced by the book The Prodigal Son? And I have not read that book, although I'm now aware of it, and I plan to read it. I actually, the book that I mentioned was Hard Rain Falling was a very big influence on me to write this book. I got so excited about reading it that I said I want to try and do something like this, but with my own sensibility. And then the other question was about what's really the most fun for me? Is it research? Is it writing the book? I have to say that the research is really a lot of fun. It's the thing that I'm most anxious to get out and do because that's how the book forms in my head, is when I get out there and start talking to people. And because I don't outline or anything like that, I really don't have a plan. The book is not plotted out before I read it. With a book like The Night Gardener, I was very fortunate to get access to the homicide police in D.C., the violent crimes branch. They let me go along with them on a very high-profile murder in the city, and I was with them from the day the murder was committed to, I went to the morgue, did a lot of interviews with witnesses around the city, potential witnesses, and then I watched the confession in the box, and so I was along for the ride. But what was really most valuable, and this pertains to everything that I do, was just being in those offices with those homicide police and kind of looking around and looking at their desks. And, they had, for example, up on their cork boards over their desks, they had a lot of religious imagery, icons and that kind of thing, pictures of their kids, and then in the mix they had a lot of photos of corpses that had been victims of violent crimes, and that kind of told me a lot. The mix of that, and just listening to their humor, and that really is what's more important to me than the actual details of the forms and what's said on investigations. It's who are these people, and that's what's a lot of fun. I have 10 minutes. Are there any more? Yes. What did I integrate from Washington into The Wire? Well, it was a little difficult in the beginning. I don't speak the language in Baltimore, and it is different. It's 40 miles away. I was sitting one night with Anwan Glover, who played Slim Charles, and is also the leader of DC's premier go-go band, Backyard. And you might also know him as Genghis or Big G. It's on the radio. And we were watching these girls walk down the street in the middle of the night, and they were barefoot in the middle of summer. And he said, I just don't get it. These women up here are just mysterious, And I understood what he was saying exactly. It's a totally different city. The one thing that I would bring to it was, I have let's say, it's difficult to say, but I have a very it might not seem so when you read my books, but I have a very optimistic view of what's going on here and life in general. I mean, you look at what this city has become in the last 20 years, and nobody can say that we're not headed in the right direction and that things are not appreciably better. And I felt that at times on The Wire, my comrades were a little bit too grim for my taste in terms of what happened to these people all the time, you know? So a character like Cuddy on The Wire, which I brought after writing the book Drama City, which is very similar to the character Lorenzo Brown in that book, who comes out of prison, gets a job as a dog catcher in the Humane Society, and tries to lead a straight life. That's where Cuddy came from, and Cuddy's one of the few people on the show who actually finds some light at the end. Anybody else? All right, if there is nobody else, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it, y'all. Thank you. Thanks.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.